Hello, I'm Dr. Ajanta Dutt, Professor of English from Deshbandhu College, Delhi University, and this is the first lecture on Derek Walcott, a part of the Caribbean Literature series. This is for MA English, the elective course of IGNOU, New Literatures in English, MEG 8, Block 6. On this first slide, you can see a map of the Caribbean islands, and so you can see the stretch and the reach and the numerous islands that are there in this area, and this is the literature that we are going to study, but of course very little of it. The rest of it we shall read in due course on our own. So I'm opening this lecture with a small discussion on what is colonial discourse. If you see in this little picture, there are a number of places, countries that came under colonial rule, and that is why when we talk about colonial discourse, we are considering the narratives from all these regions because they had certain similarities in terms of the relationship that they engaged in with the colonial rulers. So colonial discourse was essentially about the colonized people, and it was mostly told from the point of view of the colonizers. All of them, all the various countries from where the colonizers came, they were there coming from Europe on their ships, and they were finding these natives in all these various lands whom they felt they had to educate, teach and impart their knowledge. So these colonized people, the indigenous people of these various lands, were considered uncivilized. They were lacking in culture. They were almost childlike perhaps in their behavior, and therefore they were condemned. They were condemned because the colonizers who came did not understand them. They did not think that they had a culture of their own. They did not think that they had any religion. They did not think they had a system of justice. And in most of the countries where they went, these people, especially the ones who were there in the islands of the Caribbean, they did not have a written literature. On the other hand, the colonizers who came from Europe, they considered themselves extremely civilized. They were educated and cultured, and they felt that they were not taking over these countries by force, but they were benevolent and generous rulers. So the conflict that was set up was of course that of the European conquerors being superior versus these islanders, these indigenous people who were inferior. To themselves, the conquerors were heroes, and they were pitted against these poor victims of the islands, these poor oppressed people whom they now needed to educate. So their idea of these islanders was that they were ignorant, they were without a history, and they needed to be enlightened. And the best way to do it would of course be to give that knowledge, that history, that education, that scientific know-how, all of which was there in Europe, and that needed now to be transferred to these islanders. If we move to this slide, we see now the position of the post-colonial writer. These writers, they made a significant growth and change to the narrative as it developed, especially the debate that was there between the colonial and the post-colonial writers, and especially in the 70s and the 80s, we see a great deal of change in the Caribbean islands. They challenged the perspective, the position of the colonizers, and they did this by introducing a counter discourse which also occasioned the need for a rewriting of their own history. They were beginning to realize that in the course of colonial conquest, there had been a terrible destruction of the indigenous culture. Therefore, one of the first points that needed to be made was the establishment of native history, a valorization of native history. Along with it was the culture, which had mostly been transmitted by oral transmission. As I had said before, there were no real written records, and that is why the native history, the culture, the various aspects of art and religion, all this had to be written down now, and of course the language that was going to be used was again the European language, or should I say languages, because these had now also been given or foisted upon the people. Now, when these post-colonial writers began writing, it was considered subversive writing, because of course what they did was they questioned establishment, they questioned the stance of the rulers, they questioned their ideological strategies. But along with this questioning, there was also the issue of race and what race meant. Race, that is the contrast between the black and the white, or we can specifically say the black skin and the white skin, where the white skin was again always superior. So these were some of the themes that came up again and again in the writings of the post-colonial writers from all over the Caribbean islands. Along with it, there came a revalidation of the beauty and the tradition of the islands. Again, these had to be written down, they had to be imaged in the various arts of the region, they came through in the music, and this had a twofold approach because it was being revalidated for their own people and also for the conquerors who had, some of them at least, become settlers in these new lands. There was also the theme of nation and nationhood, and if we study the political history of the region, we will understand how and how many times these islands were not attacked perhaps, but taken over, and how the politics had developed in the region and what that meant in terms of independent thought and independent nationhood for each of these islands separately. You saw that large region, the conglomeration of islands, and they had all been colonized by different European powers. So the concept of a single nation or a single nationhood was not there, and this fragmentation was felt in the writings now being indicated or provided by the post-colonial writers. The post-colonial writers also felt the need to portray patriotism and their own social identity, but along with it, they also portrayed the corruption that was there, not just because of the settlers or the rulers, but they tended to write also about the corruption in the local areas, the local corruption in the home country. So corruption again became a major theme of post-colonial writing. I move to the next slide because I feel that any lectures on colonization or post-colonial writing needs to be redefined or quoted again and again in terms of what Professor Edward Said said, and I quote, "Every empire, however, tells itself and the world that it is unlike all other empires, that its mission is not to plunder and control, but to educate and liberate." So this was the power that the colonial writers were proposing, that they were educating these native people. They were not there to exert their power through violent means, but they were giving a generous amount of knowledge that was necessary for these islands. I move on to a discussion of what then is Caribbean literature. Of course, it is the literary works from the Caribbean islands, but if we remember the diversity of these islands, then we can understand how difficult it must be to categorize the works, especially because all these works come in all the genres of literature that we are used to reading. There's a lot of poetry, there's novel writing, and playwrights have put together countless plays for this region. The significant languages are many, but the prominent ones are English, French, and German, and the post-colonial writers were writing in these languages in order to make themselves heard, not just to their own people and the settlers in the islands, but also to the world beyond, especially in England and in America. The colonial writers had not really talked about tradition in the islands because they didn't know about it. But in fact, there was a multifaceted tradition in these islands, and this had been seen in the oral narration and poetry. This multifaceted tradition was also evident now in Caribbean literature, as the writers spoke about the works of an indigenous people that had been influenced over the years, over centuries in fact, by colonial and post-colonial writings that had been handed over in terms of education. The writers understood, they realized that there was no specific indigenous tradition in the islands. You see, the pre-Columbian American Indians who had lived here, they had left behind some amount of rock carvings and inscriptions. By way of oral traditions, a lot of the culture had been passed down by word of mouth from generation to generation. But on the whole, these oral traditions had been destroyed during the waves of colonization that happened starting from the 16th century with the coming of the Spanish, the British, the Dutch, and most of the European powers. The West Africans were also brought to the islands, and they too came without a written tradition of their own. When we consider Caribbean literature, especially for our study, we will focus mainly on Anglophone literature, which is writings in English. And we will talk about the West Indies because this is a name that is often used interchangeably with the Caribbean islands. This British contribution to education and writing is significant after 1945. The name West Indies is used for the indigenous population, and later on it was used also to indicate the European settlers who lived in these islands because they had not returned to their home countries, and also people of African origin who had been brought across as slaves by the colonizers to work on the land. They had been brought because the indigenous population had mostly died out because of disease, and these new people from Western Africa, they came to work on the sugar plantations, and this is also indicated in much of European literature, especially even in English literature. So when we look at this area and we talk about the Anglophone literature from the Caribbean islands, we are looking at colonization and its colonial legacy, and we are also looking at the contrast between post-colonial and neo-colonial literature, especially British and American imperialism, because we must remember that many of the writers and intellectuals of this area had moved to England and America for higher education. So they wrote about the themes that were popular in those lands, and they brought their vision back to the lens of looking at their own homelands, their islands, through these specific issues. And some of these were gender and sexuality. Of course, English education was prominent because they were educated in English. They had studied the literatures that were given to them by the English masters, and they themselves were reading and recreating their own culture in the English language. They concentrated on the themes of racism, the black and white conflict, class conflict, which was the rich and the poor, because in general the islanders were very poor. There was, of course, the power imbalance between the rulers and the ruled, and the place of women and their new or perhaps old new positions were often very much a theme of New Caribbean writing. When we think of the Caribbean islands, we think of music, we think of rhythm, we think of vividness, and of course we remember also the novelists who made them prominent all over the world. I want to concentrate on one image of Sir V.S. Naipaul here as a writer and a Nobel laureate, but I want to show you this picture not because of his writing specifically, but to remind you that his family was part of the indentured laborers who came to the islands to work. They were slightly different from the slaves, and V.S. Naipaul's family had in fact migrated from India, and later on he went on to study in England. He received the highest honors in terms of becoming a Nobel laureate, and also he received knighthood from Queen Elizabeth II. Now, to come to Caribbean life and its poetry. We are studying poetry. We will be looking at the poetry of Derek Walcott. So, we look at poetry and remember that it is at best fragmented due to its geographical reach and extent, as poetry is a way of life that is coming from all the islands. In poetry, the writers are in search of their roots, their specific identity, and in this case I think that they are searching for both their personal and their national and even political identity as being part of that colonized country, and then later on in the neo-colonial state they are really taking back a kind of power unto themselves, and that is what is becoming the significant point of the poetry. Conflicts and subtleties of race and class are of course ever present in poetry. Also poetry which has become songs. Songs and poetry in the Caribbean life seems to intermingle and mix, and there's really no separation. But of course, when we are talking about poetry, we talk about specifically what is written down and what is handed over as a text to generations to come. So this poetry is reaffirming the indigenous culture and its history. It is bringing out the importance of language and ethnicity, and also incorporating some of the local dialects into it. And this is something that we will see especially in Derek Walcott's poetry, firstly because he comes from several different kinds of heritage in terms of the European powers and the islanders. He has several different languages in his mental makeup and in his growth, and therefore these European influences are something that we see in his poetry along with some of the local dialects, because he deliberately uses some of the words from Caribbean culture to depict his conflicts and confusion with his heritage of many languages. Of course, this European influence is seen on all indigenous poetry because the Caribbean islands have faced long years of colonial rule, and even today when we see their demonstrations of art and music, we feel the traces of colonial power in a post-colonial era. One of the foremost important ideas of poetry started the Caribbean poetry movement, where the people seem to acquire a unique voice of their own. The expression of ideas and customs, along with the local dialects, came into poetry. And this was not a mere imitation of the European writers. At this point, however, I have to tell you that the influence of the English writers like Chaucer and Shakespeare, or also the influence of other Western literatures, like for instance Greek literature, had a profound impact upon Caribbean literature, especially on the poetry of the Caribbeans. This also gave the writers an opportunity to translate, to take their own culture into the English language, and to bring the English language into their own culture, or imbue their own culture into the works of the English language, reformulate them and represent them therefore to the indigenous people. In this manner, with the Caribbean poetry movement, there was a merger of literature with other arts in the region, especially reggae and calypso music. I think we all associate reggae and calypso music with Caribbean life, and the art, that is in terms of painting, is also very vivid, and therefore literature finds its voice, a unique voice, through all these various aspects of Caribbean culture. When we look at some of the poets of Caribbean literature, we see Derek Walcott's name right on top. He was a poet from St. Lucia, and his immediate contemporary was Edward Kamau Braithwaite, who was from Bridgetown in Barbados. There are many poets of this region that we may study on our own, and especially the women have a very important role to play also in the writing of poetry and the enhancing of Caribbean literature. In this slide, I am showing you a picture of Derek Walcott because his is the poetry that we are going to study. His is the poetry that we are going to try and understand and remember in terms of many of his own conflicts and his place in Caribbean literature. But the first aspect of his poetry seems to be the sound and the rhythm, which seems to come out from the sea, or it merges with the sea. And therefore, in this quotation, which is from an interview that he gave to the newspaper The Economist in 1990, Derek Walcott said the following words, and I quote, "The sea is always present, it's always visible. All the roads lead to it. I consider the sound of the sea to be part of my body. And if you say in Patois, the boats are coming back, the beat of that line, its metrical space, has to do with the sound and rhythm of the sea itself." And therefore, when we study Derek Walcott's poetry, we too are looking at the sea, the symbol of the sea that is forever present in his work. We are looking at the sounds that he creates in his poetry. We also see that the sea for him, the sea that surrounds the islands, is the sea that is the container of history, of not just his own personal history, but also that of the Caribbean people. Thank you.